Is Bill Clinton a war criminal? A thought piece. Watching Joe Biden call Vladimir Putin a war criminal over Russia's military invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has raised some questions for me. First, let's see exactly what the President of the United States said.
Mr. President, are you ready to call Putin a war criminal?
No.
Are you ready to meet with Vladimir?
Oh, I think he is a war criminal.
I will need to start this thought piece with a disclaimer. I do not support the military operations of Russia or Vladimir Putin in any way. I simply want to explore, truthfully, how our country is lurching towards World War III without any propaganda or slanted news coverage. I want to see what happened and how we've gotten to where we are in March 2022 and possibly where we're going. The reason for this is we've seen a number of pop psychiatrist pieces on Vladimir Putin. I'll show you one.
What was going through your mind as you looked at this 5-minute Vladimir Putin rally appearance today?
Well, I was struck by the dreamy quality of it. Mr. Putin has this idea that God has something to do with his desire to bring Ukraine and Russia together by force. Over and over, he asserts that there's some kind of divine or mystical unity between these two countries. And if other people don't see this, if Ukrainians just want to live normal lives, if they think that they're Ukrainians and belong to a different country, so much the worse for them. There has to be a cleansing act of violence which will restore the world to the way.
Now, how can a Yale professor of history say that? Let's flash back to a 2014 Washington Post column by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Kissinger, far too often the Ukraine issue is posed as a showdown, whether Ukraine joins the East or the West. Kissinger continues, the West must understand that, to Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country. Russian history began in what was called Kievan Rus. The Russian religion spread from there. Ukraine has been a part of Russia for centuries, and their histories were intertwined before then. Some of the most important battles for Russian freedom, starting with the Battle of Polyvana in 1709, were fought on Ukrainian soil. Kissinger explained why priorities needed to be established in order for Ukraine to thrive. The European Union must recognize that its bureaucratic dilatoriness and subordination of the strategic element to domestic policies in negotiating Ukraine's relationship to Europe contributed to turning a negotiation into a crisis. Foreign policy is the art of establishing priorities. Kissinger called Ukrainians the decisive element because they lived in a country with a deep history and a polyglot composition, noting that the western part of the nation was incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1939, when Stalin and Hitler divvied up the spoils, but the largely Russian section of Crimea didn't become part of Ukraine until 1954. The west of Ukraine is largely Catholic. The east of Ukraine is largely Russian Orthodox. The west speaks Ukrainian. The east speaks mostly Russian. Any attempt by one wing of Ukraine to dominate the other, as has been the pattern, would lead eventually to civil war or to break up. To treat Ukraine as part of a East-West confrontation would scuttle for decades any prospect to bring Russia and the West, especially Russia and Europe, into a cooperative international system. This again is Dr. Henry Kissinger in 2014. A wise U.S. policy towards Ukraine would seek a way for the two parts of the country to cooperate with each other. We should seek reconciliation, not the domination of a faction. Russia and the West, and least of all the various factions in Ukraine, have not acted on this principle. Each has made the situation worse. Russia would not be able to impose a military solution without isolating itself at a time when many of its borders are already precarious. For the West, the demonization of Vladimir Putin is not a policy. It is an alibi for the absence of one. Kissinger said this in 2014, 8 years ago. Kissinger stated Putin should come to realize, despite grievances, that a policy of military impositions would produce another Cold War, precisely where we are today, in March 2022. For its part, the United States needs to avoid treating Russia as an aberrant to be patiently taught rules of conduct established by Washington. Putin is a serious strategist on the premises of Russian history. Understanding U.S. values and psychology are not his strong suits, nor has understanding Russian history and psychology been a strong point of U.S. policymakers. Leaders of all sides should return to examining outcomes, not compete in posturing. And look at the posturing here from Joe Biden.
Oh, I think he is a war criminal.
This is pure posturing. This is not a diplomat. This is not Mr. Negotiator. This is not the Joe Biden as a candidate who promised to bring all of his diplomatic expertise to be a nicer person than Donald Trump. Joe Biden campaigned as a completely different person than he is governing. Here was Kissinger's conclusions. 1. Ukraine should have the right to choose freely its economic and political associations, including with Europe. 2. Ukraine should not join NATO, a position I took 7 years ago when it last came up. So Kissinger is clearly a diplomat here. He was looking for a middle solution that would allow Russia to retain their traditional trade and cultural connections with Ukraine. But at the same time, he warned Ukraine should not join NATO outright, as that would be a provocative act for what Russia deems to be a traditional component of their country. If Russia's history is deeply intertwined with Ukraine, as Dr. Henry Kissinger said 8 years ago, why do we have experts on MS-NBC telling us the complete opposite?
I was most struck by that, by this notion that there's a fragmented world and it's his job as leader of Russia to restore the world the way it ought to be. It's a vision which is quite disconnected, of course, from the reality of the way that Ukrainians are suffering for no reason, and also quite disconnected from the way that Russian soldiers are behaving in Ukraine. He did think that this really was a special military operation. He really did think that the Ukrainian people would be happy to have their own government overthrown. I think he's been surprised to see that there's been so much resistance, and I think he's having difficulty processing it because he really does believe in his own story about how Ukrainians and Russians are actually one people. And now that he's been proven wrong, he's in the classic position of a tyrant. He can never admit that he's made a mistake. He has no choice but to double down. But as he doubles down and doubles down again, the only operational choice he has is to kill more civilians, which puts him in an even worse moral and economic box as time goes by. So I think the only thing that he is wondering is not how this ends. I think all he's wondering about is, will this ever reach a point where I feel that my own power might be threatened? And I think it's at that point, and only at that point, where this war might come to an end.
Now, that's an absurd statement. You just saw Dr. Henry Kissinger completely contradict every premise that this Yale professor of history made. We had no historical context from this Yale professor of history. Let's actually hear from Putin himself, because this man has been described as unbalanced and seemingly out of his mind. What I see from every Putin speech, though, is someone who believes he is firmly in the right, historically, militarily, and economically.
Именно принципиальный для России, для нашего будущего вопроса по нейтральному статусу Украины, по демилитаризации и денацификации мы были готовы и готовы сейчас обсуждать в ходе переговоров. Наша страна сделала все для организации и проведения этих переговоров, понимая, что необходимо использовать любую возможность для того, чтобы сберечь людей и их жизни. Но мы вновь и вновь убеждаемся, что киевскому режиму, которому его западные хозяева поставили задачу создать агрессивную антироссию, судьба самого народа Украины безразлична. Очевидно, что происходящие события подводят черту под глобальным доминированием западных стран и в политике, и в экономике. Более того, они ставят под сомнение ту экономическую модель, которая в последние десятилетия навязывалась развивающимся странам, да вообще всему миру. Подчеркну, санкционную одержимость США и их сторонников не разделяют страны, где проживает больше половины населения земного шара. Именно эти государства представляют собой быстро растущую, наиболее перспективную часть глобальной экономики. Развязана беспрецедентная информационная кампания, в которой задействованы глобальные социальные сети и все западные СМИ, объективность и независимость которых оказалась просто мифом. Ограничивается доступ к информации. Людей пичкают огромным количеством фейков, пропагандистских подделок. Проще говоря, липой. Дошло до того, что одна из американских социальных сетей напрямую заявила о возможности публикаций с призывами к убийствам граждан.
Now, why is it important that I play Putin's comments there? We've been told repeatedly by retired generals and other pop psychologist experts that Putin is mentally imbalanced, that he's mad, and he appears to be breaking down under some form of insanity. But if you watch his actual speeches, he is clear and measured in his tone. He looks at the camera. His eyes do not waver. He has about all the unbalance of a Siberian wolf about to pounce on its prey. Now again, I'm not defending or excusing Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but from his perspective, he is defending a portion of the Soviet Union, of Russia, that his country has deep historical contacts and ties to. And as Dr. Kissinger advised 8 years ago, he believed we should pursue economic ties to Ukraine, but not push Ukraine to join NATO. And yet everything of the President Obama administration for 8 years, and now the President Biden administration for 1 year, has been to push Ukraine to join NATO. Russia has stated repeatedly in the form of Vladimir Putin, if Ukraine signs any kind of defense pact with the West, Russia will invade Ukraine. I mean, he couldn't have been clearer. So why am I asking if Bill Clinton is a war criminal? I wanted to do a thought piece because this morning I was thinking about the bombing campaign that Bill Clinton waged. Here is the Wikipedia page on the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. In 1999, 23 years ago, President Bill Clinton bombed Serbia from March 1999 through June 1999.
To demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's purpose, so that the Serbian leaders understand the imperative of reversing course, to deter an even bloodier offensive against innocent civilians in Kosovo, and if necessary, to seriously damage the Serbian military's capacity to harm the people of Kosovo.
What began as an attack on military targets soon expanded. Schools, monuments, homes, and even the Chinese embassy were hit. At the end of the campaign, 11 weeks later, Human Rights Watch estimates around 500 civilians were killed.
Then and now, I think it was a great mistake by NATO. The bombing shouldn't have happened. I think the goals which NATO wanted to achieve could have been done with less energy, and citizens could have been spared from what happened.
Former Yugoslav leader Slobodan Milosevic died 3 years ago while on trial for war crimes in The Hague. Former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic is still on trial. His general, Ratko Mladic, remains a fugitive.
So think of that for a moment. NATO intervened in a civil war that we had no legal authority to intervene in, and we put the military generals and political leaders of Serbia on trial for genocide and other war crimes. We created an international criminal court just to prosecute these people. And I'm not excusing their conduct in any way in their ethnic cleansing, but I wanted to look at the historical context of NATO intervening in the squabbles of former Warsaw Pact members, former allies of the Soviet Union. This is a historical context that the Russian government knows full well. We went after one of their allies, that being Serbia, and put their political and military leaders on trial for opposing the political goals of NATO. For the military invasion of Ukraine, Joe Biden calls Putin a war criminal for his bombings which have killed civilians, defenseless, helpless civilians. Well, President Bill Clinton did the same thing. No one ever called Bill Clinton a war criminal, at least outside of Russia or Serbia. No one ever called Secretary of State Madeleine Albright a war criminal. I guess it's good to be in the West. You can control the economic system. You can put people on trial that you have no legal authority to do so, because you control the economy and you control the military. I would say that NATO sent a clear message to Russia that might makes right. Now, for my entire lifetime, those of us in the United States of America ridiculed the communist system for the attitude that might makes right. And yet, as a matter of practicality, hasn't this been how NATO has governed Europe all of this time in our lifetimes? NATO does have the attitude of might makes right, where we can put people on trial if we disagree with their military ambitions. We can control events completely outside of the NATO charter. NATO is a defensive organization. Well, tell that to Serbia. So let's consider for a moment the differences and similarities between the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999 and the similar Cold War today. Bill Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright bombed women, children, and the elderly in Serbia month after month of serious, severe bombings. We used every weapon in our arsenal that we pretty much had. We fired so many cruise missiles into Serbia that there was a shortage of cruise missiles in the U.S. military and Navy across the world. Serbia had no nuclear weapons to respond to us with. We had stealth fighters flying bombing missions over Serbia, the works. So look at that. We're using everything we have in our NATO arsenal, flying stealth fighters, fighter jets, bombers out of American air bases all over Europe, such as Italy here. Why? Because Serbia had no means of defending themselves, and Russia was militarily weak in 1999. What's the difference with Ukraine? Well, Ukraine is being invaded by a nuclear-armed superpower, Russia. So we're trying a low-key approach of sending Javelin missiles and other aid to Ukraine. At the same time, we've canceled Russia's economy. We've told Russia, you will have no economic system with the rest of the world. We've canceled their line of credit. American credit card companies canceled all credit cards in Russia with the snap of a finger. Apparently, they weren't even told by the Biden White House to do this. These credit card companies just did this on their own. The international banking system has shut off Russia. I'm not saying there's a moral equivalence here, but I'm saying if we're going to go into World War III over the words of Joe Biden, we had better understand the factual, historical reasoning of Russia and Putin in waging this war. What bothers me is that we have this week the President of the United States calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal based on the images of deaths of defenseless civilians in Ukraine. But we were heroes when we caused the deaths of innocent civilians in Serbia in 1999. The difference was the Serbs didn't have the media access that we do. They didn't get to air all the footage of pregnant mothers and dying children as we do.
But what began as an attack on military targets soon expanded. Schools, monuments, homes, and even the Chinese embassy were hit. At the end of the campaign, 11 weeks later, Human Rights Watch estimates around 500 civilians were killed.
So by the Biden standard, is Bill Clinton a war criminal? What is the difference here in ethnic cleansing? Except that Putin has nukes, so we don't slap him around with everything in our arsenal like we did the nuke-free Serbs. I'm not saying the Serbs or Putin were justified in any of the killings. I'm just thinking out loud. Finally, even though no one in the former Warsaw Pact country of Yugoslavia was a member of NATO, we intervened with the authority of NATO to be nice, because lives were at stake. Folks, this is precisely as Putin declared, flatly and with firmness. That was his motivation to protect loyal Russians in Ukraine. I guess I'm asking, what legal right does NATO have to intervene in Yugoslavia to pick sides? Putin has intervened in Ukraine. He picked sides. But we get to cancel the entire Russian economic system. Russia didn't cancel our economic system when the United States started bombing Serbia. We were the good guys. You can't cancel us. And we're the good guys today in 2022, after spending 14 years trying to lure Ukraine away from Russia's economy and into NATO's and the EU's economy. We are in the right, aren't we? Then and now? Now, I'm not excusing what Vladimir Putin is doing to the people of Ukraine today, but I would prefer a realistic appraisal of the situation over the pop psychiatrist analysis that we've seen of Vladimir Putin all over cable news. I'm not saying that making a moral equivalency to NATO's bombing of Serbia, which had no legal justification as NATO is a defensive organization and was not being attacked by Serbia, excuses what Putin did. But I would like to enter into World War III without fatuous statements and excuses by our side. If Putin is a war criminal, then so is Madeleine Albright and General Wesley Clark and Bill Clinton. Yet Bill Clinton today is viewed as a man of peace and a peacemaker. Not to the people of Serbia during those months of bombing he wasn't. Let's have a clear assessment of the situation and the historical context before we plunge the world into World War III, the death of millions, perhaps billions, and the collapse of our economy into the greatest economic depression the world has ever seen. All because one man wants to posture in the White House that he's a moral good person and Putin is a bad person. Is that really worth destroying our world over?